Shadow King. Good morning, church. How are we today? Quiet. You guys are quiet. How are we today? There we go. Hope everyone's having an amazing Sunday and has had a great week. My name is Brad, as Pastor David said. I'm the associate pastor here with my wife, Jackie, and we are so excited for the next couple of years here. It is a crazy, incredible time. I really love our C3 culture here. That's one of my favorite things about this church is just our church family. And, we really love you guys. And it's just such an awesome time here. Hey, if you're here for the first time, I just want to say welcome as well. Anyone here for the first time, just pop your hand up. No first timers. Well, if you are and you're too scared to put your hand up, welcome. Or if you're joining us online as well. I just want to thank the father and the mother of this church as well, Pastor David and Pastor Lil. Can we give these guys a huge round of applause? These guys are amazing leaders, and it's so nice to have you guys here this time when I'm preaching. The last few times you guys have been away and watching online, so it's really an honor to be able to be up here with you guys here as well. So thank you. And hey, awesome work, worship team. It is crazy cool to have you guys up here with us today as well. I know you guys are like, this is weird. But having these guys up here means that we can have a few more seats available out here, so with our current COVID regs. So it's really great to have these guys joining me on stage this morning. It makes me feel not so scared by myself. So hey, we're in the Shadow King at the moment, the life of David. And this is a really cool series. It's part 2. Part 1 was last week, which was Shepherd, which Pastor David preached. It was great. It was an amazing message. And I loved it. But you kind of have to ask the question, right? Like, this week we're talking about warrior. So you kind of have to ask the question, what is a warrior, right? And also, who is David in the first place? Maybe you weren't here last week. Warrior, in dictionary.com, it says it's a person that's engaged or experienced in warfare, or a soldier. If you were here a few weeks ago, I preached a message on using your weapons, your spiritual warfare weapons. And this is kind of a little bit like a part 2 as part of that, but centered around the Shadow King, which is awesome. So who is David then, right? We're not talking about Pastor David. We're talking about David, who was a person who was born just over 1,000 years before Jesus Christ. So about 3,000 years ago from today. So last week we learned that David was Jesus' shadow, and he was pointed backwards, right? So if Jesus is in the center, then David is in the past, right? So David is Jesus' shadow that way, and we are Jesus' shadow this way, yeah, into the future. So why do we call David the Shadow King though, right? Because it's a strange concept, isn't it? Shadows, right? Why do we call him the Shadow King? Well, there's a bunch of things that happened throughout history that match between David's story and Jesus' story. So it's almost as if Jesus' shadow went back 1,000 years and was seen as David, right? So David was, just a few examples of this, David was 30 when he became the king of Israel, and he reigned for 40 years, right? So Jesus was also 30 when he started his ministry. Jesus was actually born of David's bloodline as well. So David was Jesus' great, insert some greats here, great-granddaddy. So that's an interesting concept as well, right? It's actually the same bloodline there. David was a shepherd who looked after his sheep, and as Pastor David preached last week, Jesus referred to his people as sheep as well. And Jesus was born in Bethlehem, and so was David. That's where he lived. There's so many similarities, and there's way more than that. We could be here all day. But I want to tell you a little bit of a story about me. When Jackie and I started dating, it wasn't long before we talked about getting married. And this was, 10, 15, I don't know how many years ago, 10-something years ago. There we go. Confirmed from the back of the room. But we talked about getting married pretty quickly after we started dating. We kind of just knew. I don't know how to explain that, but we just kind of knew that we wanted to get married, and that was cool. And it was a bit of a struggle for us because God really kept telling me that, we had to hold off. That even though I wanted to propose and, we wanted to get this marriage happening, he just kept saying, it's not time yet. You need to hold off. And this went on for quite some time. And there was about 3 or 4 times where I kind of tried to disobey God, and I was kind of like, no, I just want to take this in my own hands. I just want to do this. Like, I'm going to make this happen. I'm going to just get a ring or do something. And it kind of always failed. Like, every time I tried to disobey and try and just take it into my own hands, somehow somehow something would pop up, like whether I'd been saving up for a ring or something like that, and suddenly I get like a big tax bill or something like that would just happen to happen, and it would just throw me off, right? This was, I remember, and I was going through my journal yesterday about this actually, but this was really, really hard for Jackie as well. It was really hard because this went on all up for about 7 years, and that's a long time. that was a long time. So I remember it just being so hard, and there were so many days where we would have conversations, and we would just be like, man, she would just be getting so down, and she's like, don't you want to marry me? Like, man, what are you doing? Like, come on. We need to hurry this thing up, right? And it felt like a battle. It really did. And I kept it was so hard because it's what I wanted, it's what she wanted. But it was a really hard time for us because we were having to do exactly what God wanted. And that's always the best way to be. So like I said, it went on for years. So about 5 years into this, right, I got home from work to find Jackie in a bit of a mess. She was crying, and she was pretty insecure and kind of talking about the fact that, why aren't we getting married? Why can't we do this? Why, it's not happening yet. And then out of nowhere, I get a call from my best friend, right? And he goes, oh man, like this is like midway in conversation. So I leave the room to take this call, and he's like, dude, I just bought a ring. I'm about to propose to my girlfriend. I'm like, what? Are you kidding me, man? I'm so excited, but at the same time, I'm comparing myself and going, man, oof. Well, that hits home, doesn't it? So that went on. That was all good. About 7 years in, so this is, we're almost going to get married. I finally felt God kind of say, all right, it's time to do it. Now is your time. And I really felt that confirmation hard, and that was awesome. It was like I'd been waiting for this for so long, right? And it was time well spent over those 7 years as well. I mean, it was hard, absolutely. But God was really working on us through that time. We had some stuff that we needed to sort it out, and he was working on us in that, which was amazing. But each time we got through a battle, we kind of drew closer to God, which was awesome. So I picked out a diamond, picked out a setting and everything like that. Pastor David, being a previous jeweler, helped me out as well, and he actually made the ring for us and put it together. But which was incredibly special and still is to this day. So I put this order in for the ring, for the diamond, had a proposal plan picked out and all of that. And then the freight got delayed. And it felt like COVID delays. Like, it was crazy that the freight was delayed for ages, and this took a few months to arrive, right? So, and through this time, like, I just remember in my head, like, everybody was telling me, hurry up and get married, hurry up and get married. Everybody was dropping hints everywhere. They were like, why don't you hurry up? And I'm like, I can't do it. I'm trying. It was crazy. And of course, I couldn't say to Jackie, I'm trying, because that kind of ruins the surprise a little bit, doesn't it? Everyone around us was getting engaged as well, all of our friends. We were just that age, like when you get to that age, all of your friends are starting to get engaged and getting married, and, we kind of wanted to join that bandwagon. I couldn't help but just compare myself with everyone and comparing us with everyone, right? It was consuming me, and it was really starting to distract our relationship, I guess you could say. So about a month passed anyway, the ring's ordered, right? It was all happening. It was happening soon. We're just waiting for it to arrive. And Jackie and I were down on holiday, down in Perth on a holiday, staying at Jackie's parents' place. And I remember one night we were having dinner, and out of nowhere, Jackie's sister bounces into the room. And she's like, yeah, you wouldn't believe it, would you? She's like, my boyfriend just proposed to me. And I'm just like, oh boy, this is going to be fun. So, yeah, I died there. That was a hard one. I remember that night just sleeping on the foam mattress in the lounge room, and I'm just going, man, I was awake the whole night, like, just thinking, just being so angry at God and just going, why is this happening? Like, Jackie's a mess right now. This sucks. Like, it was horrible. It was just fuel on the fire, and the next few days were rough as well because we were on holiday down there, right? But 2 months later, we got engaged. That was awesome. The ring arrived. Man, but it was a hard 7 years. It really, really was. And I remember asking God, why so long? Like, did it have to be this long, man? Like, and he kind of revealed to me, that it just wasn't time yet because he was growing us first. And I thought that was awesome. Like, that was really profound at the time. And I said, well, why not together? Why can't you just grow us together, man? Like, come on. Surely you could at least do that. And he goes, look, that would be too easy. if I did that, you're not going to grow anywhere near as quickly as I want you to. And I was like, wow, all right, that's rough. So it wasn't until we got married that we could actually look back on that together and we could kind of see the stepping stones that God was putting in place and the steps that we had to take there, right? And maybe you can relate to that. Maybe you have been through some storms or are going through some storms right now. Maybe they're stopping you from doing what you want to do. Maybe it's like a job situation. It could be financial problems. It could be health problems. It could be a relationship issue. You might be waiting for your partner to propose. Who knows, right? The Bible says that we will go through storms and battles in life. So how are you going to react towards them when they happen? It doesn't say you might go through them. It says you will go through them. So that's the question, and you prepared for that. Why do we as Christians keep comparing ourselves to everyone around us? Guilty. Big time. Everyone was getting married, right? Maybe you're comparing yourself to your friend in school. Maybe they're getting better grades than you. Maybe someone's got an amazing car and it's the car you've always wanted. Maybe it's kids, maybe it's work. What do we do when the battle we're fighting is too big to handle it ourselves? And what does Jesus say about how we should handle this, right? So the Bible has some answers of this. We're going to look at Matthew 14:22. So a little bit of context to back this up. Jesus had just fed 5,000 people with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And we're going to kick it off with 14:22 of Matthew. It's coming soon. There it is. Awesome. Thanks, Dante. Immediately after this, Jesus insisted that his disciples get back into the boat and cross to the other side of the lake while he sent the people home. After sending them home, he went up into the hills by himself to pray. Night fell while he was there alone, and meanwhile the disciples were in trouble far away from the land, for a strong wind had risen and they were fighting heavy waves. Does this sound a bit like a metaphor maybe for what you might be going through in a storm? It's important to note, I think, here that these guys were fishermen, right? So that's crazy, like for a storm to be rattling them. They're used to the waters. They're used to being out there and sailing, right? It must have been pretty full on for them to be so afraid. So about 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came towards them walking on the water. That's pretty profound right there alone. When the disciples saw him walking on the water, they were terrified. In their fear, they cried out, "It's a ghost!" But Jesus spoke to them at once. He said, "Don't be afraid. Take courage, for I am here." And how comforting is that straight away, right? In our storms, Jesus says, "Take courage, I'm here." And he'll be there in our most desperate moment. Then Peter called to him, "Lord, if it's really you, tell me to come to you walking on the water." "Yes, come," Jesus said. When the storm gets tough, all you have to do is welcome Jesus in. So Peter went out over the side of the boat and walked on the water towards Jesus. But when he saw the strong wind and the waves, he was terrified and began to sink. "Save me, Lord," he shouted. Now that's interesting because with focus and faith on Jesus, he could walk on water, right? That's cool. And then he focused on himself. Jesus' strength is so much stronger than our own. Where are we putting our focus? Jesus immediately reached out and grabbed him. "You have so little faith," Jesus said. "Why do you doubt me?" And I love that the scripture there says, Jesus immediately reached out and grabbed him. There wasn't hesitation. It wasn't like a waiting period. It wasn't like an insurance company where there's like a cool-off period or anything crazy. It was like, hey, immediately, no hesitation, Jesus reached out and grabbed him. And it doesn't say you of little education or courage. It's faith, right? We can either give in to fear or operate through faith. We can't have both. So when they when they climbed back into the boat, the wind stopped. Then the disciples worshipped him. "You really are the Son of God." And I love that picture of what happens when we focus our faith on God and what he can do through us. But I thought that it's interesting to see this level of faith in David's life as well. 1,000 years before Jesus had this moment, David had a similar moment on the battlefield. So we're going to turn to 1 Samuel 17 1 Samuel 17:32, and I'm just going to give you some context while we pull that up. So David was a young boy at this point. He was very, very young, And one day he was asked by his dad, Jesse, to deliver some food to his older brothers who were fighting in King Saul's army at that time. So he delivered the food to them at the battlefield and heard the giant Goliath taunting the army with his usual daily speech. So this is a big, massive giant. And David started to ask questions of the soldiers like, what's the reward for killing him? And soon King Saul, the king of the land, heard about it and asked for him. So that's where we pick up the story in 1 Samuel 17:32. Don't worry about this Philistine, David told Saul. I'll go fight him. Don't be ridiculous, Saul replied. There's no way you can fight this Philistine and possibly win. You're only a boy, and he's been a man of war since his youth. But David persisted. I've been taking care of my father's sheep and goats, he said. And when a lion or a bear comes to steal a lamb from the flock, I go after it with a club and rescue the lamb from its mouth. If the animal turns on me, I catch it by the jaw and club it to death. That's pretty full on. I've done this to, this is a young boy, right? I've done this to both lions and bears, and I'll do this to this pagan Philistine too. For he has defied the armies of the living God. And I love how David is seeing this as stages, right? So he started out, his mindset's on point, yeah? So he started out from a lion, he killed a lion, he's killed a bear, and then he's getting stronger along the way. Now he's about to tackle a giant. It's the stages, yeah? Are you paying attention to the stages that God's got happening in your life right now? I know that when we were going through a bit of a nightmare of a proposal time, we couldn't see the stages at the time either. But I found that, for me at least, it's so much clearer when you've been through it and you look back. And that's such a good reminder of where you're headed. So verse 37, the Lord who rescued me from the claws of the lion and the bear will rescue me from the Philistine. Love that he's got so much faith in God. Like, that is awesome. Straight away, this little boy is like, no, I'll be fine. It's cool. This army has tried to kill him for years and, it's all good. I've got faith in God. And he gives the battle over to him to fight, right? So he gives it to God. And that's so key. So then David goes on, kills the giant using Goliath's own sword. So he uses the giant sword to slay him. And then we're going to pick it up again in 1 Samuel 18. So after David had finished talking with Saul, he met Jonathan, the king's son. And there was an immediate bond between them, for Jonathan loved David. From that day on, Saul kept David with him and wouldn't let him return home. And Jonathan made a solemn pact with David because he loved him as he loved himself. So Jonathan, again, was the eldest son of King Saul. And Jonathan sealed the pact by taking off his robe and giving it to David together with his tunic, sword, bow, and belt. Whatever Saul asked David to do, David did it successfully. So Saul made him commander over the men of the war, an appointment that was welcomed by the people of Saul's officers alike. So my first point there is that David continually gets rewarded with a bigger challenge, doesn't he? He's looking after sheep. He's looking after lions. He's killing lions, sorry. And then bears. Then he conquers a giant, and now he's suddenly the commander of this army. But what it doesn't talk about there, it doesn't talk about what he must have gone through that time. And I think that's a really interesting perspective. As Pastor Stephen Furtick of Elevation said, this Sunday just gone, it's like a time-lapse view. And I love that concept. You're only seeing the snapshot photos of this period. There's only a few lines of scripture there, but years have passed in this time. What did he go through that time, right, to get to where he was? So verse 6, when the victorious Israelite army was returning home after David had killed the Philistine woman from all of the towns of Israel came out to meet King Saul. They sang and danced for joy with tambourines and cymbals. This was their song. Saul has killed thousands and David his 10,000s. This made Saul very angry. What's this, he said. They credit David with 10,000s and me with only thousands? Next they'll be making him king. Well, spoiler. So from this time on, Saul kept a jealous eye on David. Comparison. Comparison kills, right? It kills vision, it kills dreams, it kills people. It slows down your victory as a warrior. Man, just like me, right? Comparing myself to everyone else who was getting engaged at the time and wondering why it can't happen to me. That's what God was trying to teach me through that time. Comparison is a fake warrior orchestrated by the devil to distract you. I'm going to say that again. Comparison is a fake warrior orchestrated by the devil to distract you. And the devil is a real warrior, but comparison is just his decoy attack. How many of you know when you're comparing yourself to someone else that you're not yourself, right? It's like that TV ad, eat a Snickers. Have you heard that one? Yeah, absolutely. You're not yourself when you're in that mode. We become obsessed with measuring ourselves against someone else's highlight reel. And we strive for their God-given goals, right? But we don't realize that that's not what God had in mind for us. That's not our path and our trajectory, right? We kind of try to jump lanes into someone else's lane and run their race. Comparison distracts you from fighting the real enemy. Who have you been comparing yourself to, I wonder? Who have I been comparing myself to? Has it distracted you? Bit of self-reflection questions there. So verse 10, the very next day, a tormenting spirit from God overwhelmed Saul, and he began to, isn't that funny? A tormenting spirit overwhelmed Saul, and he began to rave in his house like a madman. David was playing the harp, as he did each day, but Saul had a spear in his hand. He suddenly hurled it at David, intending to pin him to the wall, but David escaped him twice. Saul was then afraid of David, for the Lord was with David, and he had turned away from Saul. A tormenting spirit from God. Isn't it interesting that God would send a tormenting spirit on Saul from God? Is it punishment? I don't know. Pastor David is going to unpack a bit more of this next week, which I'm excited to hear. So you might be thinking, I thought God was the good guy. He's not meant to send a tormenting spirit. How does that work? That doesn't make any sense. And I would say, if it was me, don't get in the way of what God's doing. Because if you do, you might be in the line of fire. God's a lot bigger than us and our little ideas. It's just like Matthew 16, right? Jesus was explaining to the disciples that he would have to die, and Peter said, that will never happen to you. And Jesus replied and said, get behind me, Satan. You have no idea. You've got no idea what needs to happen in this world. And I love that. That must have been so confronting for Peter, because he's just caring about his friend, you know? And he's like, oh, no, that'll never happen. And Jesus is like, get away, Satan. That's pretty extreme. So verse 13, finally Saul sent him away and appointed him as commander over 1,000 men, and David faithfully led his troops into battle. David continued to succeed in everything he did, for the Lord was with him. And when Saul recognized this, he became even more afraid of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David because he was so successful at leading the troops in battle. So verse 17, one day Saul said to David, I'm ready to give you my older daughter, Merab, as your wife. But first you must prove yourself to be a real warrior by fighting the Lord's battles. For Saul thought, I'll send him out against the Philistines and let them kill him rather than by doing it myself. Who am I, and what is my family in Israel that I should be the king's son-in-law? David exclaimed. My family is nothing. Why would you give this to me? So when the time came for Saul to give his daughter Merab in marriage to David, he gave her instead to Adriel, a man from Meholah. In the meantime, Saul's daughter, Michal, had fallen in love with David, and Saul was delighted when he heard about it. Here's another chance to see him killed by the Philistines, Saul said to himself. But to David he said, today you have a second chance to become my son-in-law. Then Saul told his men to say to David, the king really likes you, and so do we. Why don't you accept the king's offer and become his son-in-law? So when Saul's men said these things to David, he replied, how can a poor man from a humble family afford the bride price for the daughter of a king? And when Saul's men reported this back to the king, he told them, tell David that all I want for the bride price is 100 Philistine foreskins. Now that's a weird thing to request. Vengeance on my enemies is all I really want. But what Saul had in mind was that David would be killed in the fight. David was delighted to accept the offer, and before the time limit expired, he said that he and his men went out and killed 200 Philistines. So Saul requested 100, and he killed 200. Then David fulfilled the king's requirements by presenting all the foreskins to him. So Saul gave his daughter, Michal, to David to be his wife. And this brings me to my third point, and that's that David had other warriors around him. that helped him. It says in there, he and his men went out and killed 200 Philistines. He doubled Saul's requirements. And how did he do that? He did it with other warriors around him, with his friends, right? He had a community of warriors around him. Who's helping you fight? Who's helping you fight the battles in your life right now? What warriors are you surrounding yourself with from this room, from our community here and online? I think this is where we need to be in a community group. If you haven't heard of a community group, it's a connect group. It's exactly the same thing. But why do we call it a community group? I think we call it a community group because it's about the community. When Saul realized that the Lord was with David and how much his daughter Michelle loved him, Saul became even more afraid of him and remained David's enemy for the rest of his life. Every time the commanders of the Philistines attacked, David was more successful against them than all of the rest of Saul's officers. So David's name became very famous. Whatever storm you're going through, I think you've got to recognize that they're normal. That's the first thing that we have to know, is that they're normal. As James says in James 1, he says, count trials as joy. Now that's quite a hard mind shift, isn't it? It's like, man, we always think of trials as a hard, bad thing, right? But he says to count it as joy. And it's actually God's way of growing you. And then he rewards you with the next challenge. I don't know about you, but that sounds pretty full on. Like, the next challenge is a reward, really? But that's what Scripture says. It says that it's a reward, because it builds us into the person we need to be. The other thing that's so important here is that David's vision aligned with God's vision for him. And that's the real difference between Saul and him straight away. You know, like, David's vision was what God had in mind for him. And Saul, on the other hand, well, Saul was looking at David instead. He was in the wrong lane, wasn't he? And it meant that Saul was no longer effective because he was too worried about trying to run David's race than his own. To get God's visions done, you can't get distracted by the fake warrior, right, of the devil. Comparison. We've got to run our own races. But the devil's going to try and distract us through that. And we all have battles, but it wasn't until much later that Jackie and I, you know, we worked out that God was working on her as well. And he was teaching her to trust me to listen to God. And that was profound for me later. I was like, wow, I didn't realize that, you know, that you were going through that struggle. And I think that's so powerful as well. But the question I have for you is, will you give up in the battle? Or will you win? The battles are going to help us grow. So when we win one battle, then God's going to give us the next one. But the most important thing about the battle, right, is that we can't do it without Jesus. That's really the bottom line, is that we need Jesus to do that. And just like Peter, I think, you know, we'll sink in the water if we take our focus off him. Maybe that's something you've never tried. Maybe you've never kind of had that conversation with Jesus before. We're going to give you that opportunity to start that right now. So why don't we all stand? Jackie and I waited 7 years to be able to get married. But Jesus has been waiting a lot longer than that. If you'd like to give your heart to Jesus, then we're so excited for you. Why don't you just close your eyes this morning and we're going to pray this prayer together. I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God and the Savior of the world. I believe he died and rose again to forgive my sin and give me life. I receive your grace by faith. Come into my life, make me new. I'll follow you. Hey, if you just gave your heart to Jesus for the first time, then we are so excited for you. Let's give everyone a round of applause. I'm going to call up Pastor David again.
Thanks, Brad. Let's just give Brad an encouragement. So good. I've got a few good points out of that I'm going to pop into mine next week. So, all right, we're going to hand back to the music team for a time of singing. So stay with us. If you've been joining us online, that's officially the end of the online service, but thank you for joining us. You might see a couple of links down there where you would want to let us know if you've prayed that prayer for the first time, and also there's an opportunity for you to partner with us as we build the church in this place and beyond. Thanks for watching.